Hello, and welcome to today's presentation. I'm Diane Okonski, and I'm very happy you could join us today. The INLUS webinars, classes, scholarships, and grants are possible only with the support of our members and donors. If you are already a member of the INLUS, thank you for your support. If you haven't joined yet, please consider doing so. Our information can be found at inlus.org. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the INLUS website within the week. We encourage you today to submit your questions via the Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of Henrik's presentation. Last summer, I went on an educational tour called a Rune Round. We went to South Jutland, Denmark. There we studied runes and learned about Viking history, and I came back with far more knowledge than I ever had. The tour was organized by the American Association of Runic Studies, along with experts in the fields of runology and linguistics, including Dr. Henrik Williams. Educationally, I was probably far below a novice, but I was welcomed into the group, and it was an exceptional experience. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Henrik Williams. He is joining us from Sweden, where he is the professor of runology at Uppsala University. And I might add, he is the world's only professor of runology. Henrik, welcome, and thank you for talking with us today. I know you have a lot of information to share with us, so I'm just going to turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much. You won't see me on the screen very much more because I'm going to now start sharing my screen with you here. Yes. So thanks for having me. I've been asked to give you a crash course in runology, something that I've been studying for 35 years now. Now I have 45 minutes to share all my knowledge. And I hope that after this webinar, you will know at least the basics about runes and runic inscriptions. But let me start by dispelling three common misconceptions about runes. If you read about this topic on the internet, you will find that 90% of what you find there is plain fantasy or just wrong. Although I could say that Wikipedia is reasonably trustworthy. So the first misconception is that runes are symbols. And this derives from the fact that each runic character has a designation consisting of a proper noun. And the words chosen start with a sound that the rune represent. So the H rune was called hail, the N rune need, the I rune ice, the B rune birch, and so on. This is only a convenient way of using the runes. How else would you know which rune would stand for which sound? And they basically wrote the way that they talked in those days. There were no schools, no spelling, nothing like that. So the three major systems of runic writing you will find here. It's the older runes from the 2nd century AD until around 700 or so, and it has, as you can see, 24 runes. Some of those, the runes are on the top line, and then the transliteration that we call it on the second line. And some of these you're not familiar with. The third, there is the sound used both for th and th, and then there is a rune in the middle here. Can you see my pointer? This one. Which is, we're not sure. It's hardly ever used. So I just put in we think it might be a sh sound or something like that. And then we have this rune out over here, which is an ing sound. We would carve that or write that ng, and so they did too. These runes are very rare because we only have like one inscription every year in that time that they're used. Then the Viking Age starts in the beginning of the 8th century, and they have done something drastic. They've cut down these 24 runes into just 16. And exactly why, we're still not sure. We know one of the reasons was that the words used changed in this time. There were some drastic changes in language. New vowels appeared, and many of the words designating certain runes didn't have the sound value anymore that they were supposed to, so they couldn't be used for that. And someone probably just sat down and said, well, let's just skip all this and settle on a very basic set where you would use the same rune. The T rune, for example, would stand for both T and D, the B rune for both B and P, and so forth. And not all vowels were covered. You would use the O rune for many of the Ö and the U and the so forth, and the same with the other that you have here. And this Viking set is then used for several centuries until the end of the Viking Age, which runologically would be a little bit into the 12th century, actually, even though archaeologically and historically, we usually say the middle of the 11th century. Then we enter into the medieval period, and then even the Scandinavians come in close contact with the Christian church. Of course, they have done that already in the Viking Age, but Christian writing, and they realize if they want to write stuff, and sometimes they would even write in Latin, you need one rune for every Latin letter. So they expanded the runic set into the full set here, and they also reorganized it. It used to be called the Futhark after the first 6 runes. So you can see the top and the middle, but now eventually they ended up with an proper alphabet ordered like this. So this is the basic system. Runes are just letters, nothing more really. They can be used to write any language, they wrote early German, early English, early Scandinavian languages. They can write Latin words, they can write Greek words, they can even write Hebrew words if they want to. Everything is possible. It's just like our letters. So this second common misconception is that runes are magic. And this is something which is quite common. And most of the stuff on the internet you find, I'll go back here, will tell you that runes have a magic function. Well, they're not magic in themselves. They can be considered magic. Obviously, they are on the internet, and especially in much later times. And they can also be used to carve text with magic intent. And that was what I was going to show you here. This is a runic amulet, about 1,000 years old. And you can see the runes here. It's actually only an inch square, this amulet, on copper or bronze. It's a little metal plate. You can see the outlines of a fish down here, and then the runes up here. And this amulet is very hard to read. This has been done by an expert, and the runes here are only a fraction of an inch high. And as you can see, some of them are very, very difficult to see. This has been taken under extreme circumstances through great magnification in a microscope. So perhaps they weren't even meant to be read by humans. So they were directed towards God. And what does this say? The translation is this one: help me, listen, he who is cunning. The spell drew all evil from Bovi, which we suppose is the person who benefits from the charm of this amulet. May Thor protect him with a hammer which came from the sea. This refers to a well-known myth where Thor tries to kill the Midgard serpent and throws his hammer after the sea. But obviously the hammer was like a boomerang. It returns to him after he throws it. Flee from evil. Sorcery will not obtain from Bovi what it seeks. Gods are under him and over him. And what we need to note here is that god Thor, which of course is a heathen god, is mentioned, and also the plural gods. And the Viking society was polytheistic. They had many gods, Odin and Freya and so forth. So is this actually then a heathen amulet? Unfortunately, we can't date it exactly. It's from either the 11th century or possibly early 12th century. Well, it's quite possible actually that it is heathen, and it's equally possible that it is Christian, or the third possibility is that it is both, because in these times people were not so worried about sticking to one religion always. For example, we have a mold form where somebody made both the little Christian crosses and Thor's hammer. So obviously there was a market for both at the same time. And we also have from an Icelandic saga an account of a man who was a good Christian, but when he went out on the sea, then he made offerings to Thor because he didn't think that Christ would, be powerful enough out in the ocean. So if I account this, runes are not magic. They cannot be used for forecasting, which is one of the most common things that you find on the internet. So if they're not magic, how were they used? Well, mostly just to write ordinary texts. And being a Swede, of course, I will start with some Swedish stuff here and show you a very typical Swedish runestone. This one happens to be carved on a rock face just outside Stockholm. And the inscription itself is very easy to read. I've actually chosen the most easy to read runic system there is for this purpose. And a Swede would actually quite easily understand the language here if they knew runes, if they could read runes. Otherwise, runic Swedish is much closer to modern Icelandic than it is to modern Swedish. And I'm going to read this out to you in Viking Age Swedish. It would then be Svein let rista runar efter Thorbjörn broder sin. And those of you who know any Icelandic would easily recognize this. At this time, there are sounds that are still present in Icelandic and in English, but not in Swedish anymore, like the W in Swain. You don't have that in Icelandic, but in English, of course. And you have this rune that I've shown you the Futhark before, this strange looking thing. This stands for here Thorbjorn, and over here for in brother. So this is also the basic message on 98% of all the runestones. You have a memorial formula. Somebody erects the runestone or carves the runes or something like that in memory of a person who is their relative or sometimes their partner, trade partner, but mostly their father or mother or son or daughter or something like that. So this third misconception about rune, which is very common, is that runes are intrinsically pagan. Well, they're not. Most of them are actually Christian, and very, very few are heathen, and the vast majority would be explicitly Christian. Just to show you one example, I particularly like this one. It's a runestone from the west of Sweden, and it has a regular memorial formula that I'm not going to go into, but it ends with a very elaborate prayer. May God and the Mother of God and the Holy Christ in heaven help his soul. And this is nice in a way because it's the only inscription where it infers that there is a God the Father. Otherwise, it's just God, and probably meaning Christ. But here it specifies three entities, and the Trinity for modern Christians would be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But here it's actually the Father, the Mother, and the Son, right? Which is actually quite common. The Catholic Church does not teach this, but this is a quite common misconception among Catholics, even into modern days, that this is what the Trinity consists of, having the Virgin Mary having an elevated position. Of course, she's the one referred to here as the Mother of God. I've also circled a strange little symbol there in the middle of the stone, and you might wonder what this is, and so did I, until an art historian told me that this is, of course, a cross. We see that, but this little bow underneath means that this is the cross of Christ standing on Golgotha, and this thing here symbolizes Adam's grave mound, because that was a medieval myth that the cross of Christ was erected on top or raised on top of Adam's tomb. So you have the old Adam, the sinful guy, and then the new Adam, the new man, Christ, who saves the world. So that little very simple symbol says a lot about how Christian people had really turned even in the mid-11th century in this part of Sweden. But there are runestones outside of Sweden, I have to admit that, and runic inscriptions as well, of course. And this is a table that I need to remake because it's getting to be a little bit old now. It's not quite up to date, but you get a general idea. And I've put these in order of quantity so that the countries with the most inscriptions are on top and going all the way down. And some of the countries you find here may actually surprise you. You wouldn't perhaps believe that there are runic inscriptions in Switzerland and Czechoslovakia and so forth. But yes, there are. And you can see how old this is because I've clumped together Russia, the Ukraine, and so forth. And today I would not do that because it wouldn't be suitable, but there are actually inscriptions there as well. The one I would like you to pay attention to, given that you are in an Icelandic League, is Iceland, which has no inscriptions from the pre-Viking era, and this, of course, is rare anyway. There are none here according to this table in the Viking Age, and then you have about 50 or so in medieval times. We'll get back to that, but remember, no Viking ones and about 50 medieval ones. So I'm going to go to the countries which have the most inscriptions, and that, of course, is in Scandinavia. Here's where they are concentrated. Scandinavia has over 90% of all authentic runic inscriptions, and by authentic, these days we mean inscriptions before 1500, because after 1500, academics and other writers starting publishing the various books and other things about runes, and then people were inspired by those books rather than what they were taught by their parents. And you can never be sure. Most of the inscriptions after 1500 are actually, they're still runic, but they're not authentic in the sense that I mean here. And in Denmark, you can see that it has a lot of the oldest inscriptions, about 60% of all the ones before the Viking Age. And this is probably where runes were first invented as well. So that rhymes well. In Viking times, Sweden comes out ahead and has about 80% of all Viking runic inscriptions. And these are, of course, extremely important because they make up the only original sources we have to the Viking Age. And then in medieval times, you have Norway, which has 60% of all the medieval inscriptions. And lots of those are on wooden items, usually just rune sticks, and consist of everything. I'm not going to go into that very much today, but it's a fascinating topic in itself. Instead, we'll go back in time to the very first runic inscription that we have, which is on a bone comb. It's been archaeologically dated to around 160, which is a very precise dating for any runic inscription, especially this old. And it says, it has the runes H-A-R-J-A, Harja. And you may not be very much impressed seeing this, but even though it does not seem like much, for the first time we can weekly hear the whisper through the distance of 2 millennia, Harja. And who will ever even hear the whisper of any of our names 2,000 years from now? So as I tell my students, if you want to live eternally, carve your name with runes, something that will be preserved. Someone once said that no one is truly dead until that person's name is mentioned for the last time. And many of these inscriptions contain names, and even though we know nothing else about these people, except that the names sometimes will tell them a little bit about them, at least we still repeat their names, and I find that enjoyable. But as I said, going forth in time again, most of the inscriptions from the Viking Age or at all, they consist of rune stones in Sweden. And here is a map of the Viking Age and medieval inscriptions in Sweden. And this map now contains also provinces that were once Danish and Norwegian territory. Danish in the far south, of course, 3 provinces there, which have a fair number of inscriptions, and then some Norwegian territories in the west and the northwest, but they don't have as many. And you can see that there is a great concentration of rune stones between Stockholm and Uppsala. Uppsala is just up here. So from here to here, you have over 1,000 rune stones, which is irritating for me, who I come from this place here, Kalmar, and we don't have very many at all. You've already seen one runic inscription, the one on the rock face, but I should point out that rune stones should not look like that. This is what they should look like. We know for a fact that they were painted in several colors. This one has three of the most common ones, reddish, white, and black. The red and white are both in color. The pigment there is lead oxide, different kinds, and the black is probably soot-based. But they could use many other colors. The only color I've never seen is actually green. So that's what they could do. And we know for a fact that they were colored, they were painted, because we found runestones built into churches so soon after they were first painted. There are still traces of color. So this one comes from the Baltic island of Öland, just outside my home city. And that's a place particular where they've been rather late. Runestones have been built into the church, and then when they dug them out, they found traces of the original color. Also, there are one or two inscriptions that tell you that so-and-so carved and another person painted, and that's, as you can see there on the left, not on this particular stone, but that does occur. And the third reason is that once you've seen a runestone painted like this, you realize that they all had to be, because it's just so much more beautiful and impressive. It gives this fantastic three-dimensional feel to looking at a runestone. And we should remember that runestones are not primarily textual. It's not just to commemorate somebody, but they are original pieces of art. And some of them, like this one, is, I would say, every bit as good as any Picasso or Van Gogh or anything like that. And the strange thing is that they're just left out there in the acid rain. And sometimes if they're small enough, like this one, they've been stolen, but returned. Usually, it's not very easy to sell one of these. I should also point out that not all runic writing in the Viking Age was done on impressive runic monuments such as this one. You have everyday items as well. And from the same island of Öland, I'll just show you this little tiny piece it's a fragment of stone. And I'm particularly fond of this one because when it was found, it was read nichts, which means nothing in any language. And it was kept in the museum in my home city. And when examining it, I read it. And then I just turned it around like this. And then suddenly it says a completely different word. It says hein, which is the Scandinavian, early Scandinavian word for a whetstone, which you still preserve in English as hone. So it's exactly the same word. And this happens to be a fragment of a whetstone. So it adds up very nicely. It's also one of the earliest inscriptions from this island. We can tell that from the shape of the H and the A rune. We have other objects with more perhaps impressive inscriptions, and this is perhaps the greatest of them all. This is the church ring from Putta, which is in the north of Sweden, one of the most northerly runic inscriptions we have. It's from around 900, and the text there is the first legal statue preserved in the original from any Scandinavian country. And it has an interesting contents. It specifies fines for not reciting the law properly. So this is probably a thing ring, a ring made of iron, rather big, about a foot in diameter, that was kept at the law assembly where all the free men were allowed to come and take votes and stuff. And you didn't write things down very much, a little bit in runes, but not full. Like the law was recited orally, and the law speaker had we know that from later sources, had the duty to recite 1/3 of the law each meeting. And if he couldn't do this properly, he was fined. The first time he misspeaks, he's fined 1 ox and 2 ounces of silver. That's a pretty stiff fine. The second time it happens, he's fined 2 oxen and 4 ounces of silver. And if it does happen a third time, he loses everything he owns. I mean, this is 3 strikes and you're out very early. So this, of course, is a unique find. We have nothing else like it. Going back to runestones, I'd like to show you this one. Particularly that someone has left their suitcase there, little red thing. This is in a very impressive place. Behind it, you see great burial mound. I think this actually may be the biggest burial mound we have in Scandinavia. And the runestone itself is really, it's like 10 feet tall and has a very nice, very unique ornamentation. We have nothing like this one. And the placement of the stone, because it's in the original place, is also important because actually there was a road passing by just by the stone here and going past these stones over here. And here, down in the copse of woods, there is a ford. It used to be, of course, greater, but now it's just a trickle of water. So people had to pass this to ford the river. And also, this is a very important road because it's on the route that the kings of Sweden who were elected at Uppsala, they had to go around 6 of the other provinces and get their election confirmed. So, and they had to pass by this thing. So they have certainly seen this in the Viking Age, which I think is pretty important. But it also spells out that runestones are made for show. They were meant to be seen. People read these things and they had the messages were passed on, and whoever was most knowledgeable in a traveling party, probably they all dismounted when they came to runestone, and that person would read it out. I should be honest and tell you that although Sweden has the most runestones, of course, there are runestones elsewhere. Denmark has hundreds of them, very wonderful ones, but we're going to head out west this time in my counting and just show you that Norway doesn't need to be ashamed either, although it only has about 50 runestones, proper runestones. And why that is something I'll return to. This one is a particularly well-known. It's the Dyna stone, and it's these days, it's actually, I think this may be a copy, but it's a nicer picture because the original is kept in a museum, which is good because then the acid rain won't destroy it. It says Gunvor Thridrik's daughter made the bridge in memory of her daughter Astrid. She was the handiest maiden in Hadeland. That's a beautiful thing to have. Exactly what her handiness consisted of, if she was good at sewing or something else, we don't know. But it's interesting to see women were very much involved in the erection of runestone. About 30% of the ones in my home in the province around Uppsala mentions women, although mostly in the capacity of the commemorators. They were the ones who raised the runestones after their husbands or fathers and sons, whereas it's much more rare that a woman is mentioned also in the capacity of the commemorated person. But that does occur as it does on this stone. So why didn't they carve runestones more in Norway? Well, obviously because they were busy doing something else. They were traveling. The Viking Age is known for the Viking raids and trades all over the world, more or less. And this is a runestone left by people, a family of a person who did travel. It's set at Arlanda Airport. It's not set in where people depart because that would scare them off because the contents tell you about somebody who died abroad, but rather a little bit off to the side in the entrance and the hall. And this, of course, being Sweden, these are not Norwegians going west, but Swedes going east. And this particular stone tells you about a person who has died out in the east together with a person called Ingvar. And that Ingvar happens to be an historically known person. And we know that through an Icelandic saga. He's called Yngvar Vidförli in Icelandic, and it's Ingvar the far-traveled in English. And he sets out at the beginning of the 11th century with a great many ships and goes across the Baltic and then into Russia, down the Russian rivers, all the way down to the Caspian Sea. Can you believe that? And unfortunately, they encounter lots of trouble, and most of the people, including Ingvar, die from some disease, and very, very few make it back, according to the saga. And we know that this is an historical, it's just not an Icelandic imagination, but it's a true historic fact because there are over 20 such runestones in central Sweden telling you about people who died abroad together with Ingvar. And they did just not make it all the way to the Caspian, probably all the way over to the Aral Sea, which is even, you're into Iran now, or Turkmenistan, that far away. So they really got around. They also went south. You have ruins in Istanbul, in the great, it's now a mosque, but it used to be a church, Hagia Sophia, the wonderful cathedral. And there's runic graffiti in several places. And this is a marble line, which is now in Venice, but it was taken there by the Venetians from Athens in the 16th century. And you can barely make out on the shoulder of the line here, the marble line, there is a runic inscription. It's very badly damaged because marble, of course, is not very resistant stone. And also because soldiers, you can see that, use this for marksmanship, to shoot. So they ruin most of the inscription. It's very difficult to read. I should point out that Swedish Vikings weren't really Vikings, even though Swedes don't want to hear about this. They were called Varangians. And the true Vikings, they went west. So the Norwegians and the Danes did go mostly to England. And they've left behind a good many of these inscriptions. You have about 90 Viking inscriptions in England, and as many carved by the English themselves in their old Anglo-Saxon runes. And this one is from St. Paul's Cathedral in London, probably from the early 10th century or 11th century or the late 10th century. We don't know exactly. It's just an ordinary inscription by a man who's died there. And the question then is, they made it to England, they made it to Ireland, Scotland. How far west did they make it? Well, we have a few runic inscriptions on the Faroe Islands, and one of them is from the Viking Age. And then we go all the way to Iceland. And I remember that I told you that there were 55 from Iceland, but there were no Viking inscriptions. And this is what I believed. Recently, however, this book was published by a former doctoral student of mine, actually, Þórgunnur Snædal. And not only does she have 102 objects, but 5 of those are from the Viking Age. Now, in her book, she includes all the runic inscriptions, graphic on objects. So about 25 or so are from modern times, that is from 1500 after, but she still expands from 55 to about 75 known inscriptions on Iceland. So I need to update my chart. And one of the Viking inscriptions she does have is very exciting. You may not think so when you look at it. This is a yew wooden stick, about 5 inches long, and it has the remnants of 3 runes there towards the end. And that doesn't mean much, perhaps. But the fact that it's been safely dated to about 900 AD is important in itself, showing that runes were indeed used on Iceland, even though only carved in wood, as far as we know now. But the find site is exciting because this is in central Reykjavik, exactly where the first Icelandic colonist, Ingólfur Arnarson, settled in 874. So it may even be a carving by he himself. So that, of course, for runologists is very exciting, and for you as Icelanders, those of you who are, should be too. As a Swede, I have mixed feelings because I am reminded that in the 860s, that is at least a decade before Ingólfur came there, there was this person of Swedish heritage, Garðar Svavarsson, who did encircle all of Iceland and actually did put foot on ground too, but didn't actually settle. But if he had done so, it wouldn't be called Iceland anymore, but it would be called Garðarsholmi, and we would have it as Swedish colony. So, as I said, there are very few inscriptions from the Viking Age, but they do exist. And most of them are then from the medieval times, after 1100 or so. And the most famous, probably, I've chosen a drawing here, just part of this is a door from Balthjolfsstaður, around 1200 AD. And this is the panel showing a king fighting a dragon. You can see that in a lower panel. And at the top, he's obviously dead, and a lion rests on his tomb, and it bears a runic inscription. And the first word, unfortunately, is obliterated, but it probably says, "See the mighty king carved here who killed this dragon." I was going to show you the majority of the Icelandic inscriptions are grave slabs. This is what I found. Absolutely not a single picture of an Icelandic medieval grave slab is available anywhere. And you go, most of them, almost all of them are kept in the National Museum in Reykjavik, and they have no information about them. I know people have visited and they don't even seem to know that they maintain these things. So we'll have to skip over that part and just realize that even though Iceland doesn't have very exciting runes, stones, or inscriptions at all, in the old times, things change. And we should remember, okay, they don't have very great runestones, but they had their Icelandic sagas, which is a major contribution still to world literature, and the Eddic poetry, of course, which is another great contribution. Absolutely beautiful. And all of this was written in manuscripts. And from after 1500, several hundred years, we have a number of runic manuscripts. And these contain enormous amounts of information about runes that we would otherwise not know. So the Icelanders have made their contribution to runology as well. Some of it is very much concentrated on, fixated on, I would say, even on magic and other esoteric matters, but there's plenty of interesting and valuable stuff there too. We probably wouldn't been able to decode the famous Rök runestone as easily if we had had access to information from Iceland. Some of you who have seen that will recognize some of the symbols down here on the Rök stone as well. So they made it to Iceland, and obviously they did carve a few runic inscriptions, even the Viking Age and furthermore. Did they go get further west? Yes, they did. They made it to Greenland. There, we don't have any Viking Age inscriptions. We do have a number of medieval ones, and they have no rune stones. And you may think that this is a rune stone, but actually, this is only like 4 or 5 inches long. So, and it's the world's most northernmost find. Someone put this in a cairn when they were out on a little expedition, and they carved this, and it was put in there. And you look at the runes, these were probably carved in the 14th century. They look like they were carved yesterday. I've seen this object myself. And at one point, I know because it's kept in the National Museum in Copenhagen, they were even unsure whether they had the original or one of the copies that had been made of it, but they obviously figured it out. So then that leads to the question, did they make it all the way to North America? Well, we know for a fact that at least some of them did. We all know about Leifur Eiríksson, Leif Erikson, as it's called usually in the United States. There's a statue of him in Boston with runes that I'm not going to speak about today. I don't want to wish to sow discord, but it does make me a little bit upset that in the United States, Leif Erikson is usually proclaimed to be Norwegian. And his day, which I think is 9th of October, Norwegians is like their national day. And that's just because his family stems from Norway, but the guy was an Icelander, if anything, or a Greenlander. So I think that, should put the record straight there. So at least he made it to North America. I think that probably he could have made it into the United States or today's modern United States, but we know we've found one settlement, as you all know, in Lansel Meadows on Newfoundland. There is at least one Icelandic runic inscription in the United States, the Waukegan horn. This was found in a pile of dirt in Waukegan, which is a suburb of Chicago, in 1952. And it was brought to the attention of a cryptologist who dated the American runic inscriptions. And we know about 100 objects that have been claimed to be runic in the United States and Canada these days. And this was one of them. And he said 2 things. First of all, he could date it to December 15, 1317. And he also said that the inscription itself, most words have no meaning. Well, it turns out that they do have meaning, because this is proper Icelandic. That's those of you who know probably recognize some of the words. This is translation made for me by Judith Jesh, who understands these very complicated texts better than I do. I'm not going to read it out to you. But it turns out that this horn was made by an Icelander, the artist Hjalmar Laurusson, who also composed this inscription and made the horn itself around 1910 to 1920. So that proves two things. First of all, that whoever dated this to the 14th century was not correct, and probably wasn't in other cases as well. But also that I can well understand they thought finding it in a pile of dirt, you could think that it's an archaeological find. But one needs to be careful about these things. So to show you my final picture and to turn things really Icelandic, I go to Gimli. This is where they, 10 years ago, celebrated the 125th anniversary of Icelandic National in Gimli. I was told that one of the favorite jokes was trying to get people to pronounce Icelandic National, and most of them couldn't. So they weren't true Icelanders. The days of the Icelanders. And the inscription itself here, you can see that it's very nicely laid out and that it has a triquetra, which is a three-cornered little thingy up here, symbol taken from a Danish runestone. And the runes in modern English state that these runes were written on this stone to commemorate the 125th anniversary of Icelandic National and the courage of the Icelandic settlers of 1875 and their descendants, unveiled on August 3rd, year 2014. Janie Weston made me. And Janie Weston is the stone carver, and she's the woman standing right there. It's a beautiful inscription, and she's carved several, and they're always in modern English, but with proper runes. And I think this is a fitting end. Runes are now entering their third millennium and are as popular as ever. And all I can say is cherish them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Henrik. That was fascinating. I always learn so much. While we're waiting for people to submit some questions, I have a question for you. How did you become interested in runes?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm here today, because I feel that I owe it to you. I studied runes at Uppsala University when I first got here. I had several classes. I had seen runestones. I was not in the least interested. It took a year in the United States as a teaching assistant at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where one of my professors was Elmer Antonsen, a Danish American. And he was a runologist and a specialist in the very oldest runic inscriptions, and published a corpus edition and so forth. And he was on leave that year, but he was nice enough to take time off to meet me once a week and discuss these things. And it's interesting how often you get blind to things that are closest to you, right? So to me, this was nothing special. And it isn't to most Swedes. People are much more interested in runes elsewhere. But I realized then just how unique these things are. There's nothing like it really in the rest of the world. And runes themselves, as a writing system, has the unique character of being present in an oral society. 99.99% of everything was passed on orally, people. And that means that runes were very much tuned into that. And you can see lots of oral functions or features present in runic inscriptions as well. People wrote as they pronounced things, which is fantastic for a linguist like myself. And of course, the contents and the challenge of reading a 1,000-year-old runestone and perhaps being the first person in a millennium who understands what it says, that just fills me with chills still.
Marvelous, marvelous. So I have another question. When I was on the rune round last summer, it was actually rune round number 5. You've been many places around the US and the Scandinavian area. I understand there might be a rune round 6 in the planning process. Is it at a point where you can tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the proper person to do that would be Lorraine Johnson, who is listening in on this. She's the president of the American Association for Runic Studies, and she will not rest easy until she drives me into the ground with these rune rounds. And I know that she has set her eyes on a rune round on the island of Gotland, which is a wonderful place to visit, even without runic inscriptions, but they have some of the most marvelous runic inscriptions too. And the churches are just filled every time they in the plaster of the church, because they had, I can't remember, like 200 medieval churches. I mean, it's just loads of them everywhere. And, of course, they're plaster on the walls, and people were bored. So they would carve their little things into the wall. And they used runes even into the early 17th century on Gotland. And every time they go out, someone says, "Oh, we found a new inscription." So they go out and to inspect it. And it seems when they are there, they look at the other parts of the walls and they will find even more. So there are now a good many of these inscriptions. I personally find them boring but other runologists are totally fascinated, to each their own. But the rune stones you have the picture stones on Gotland as well. So if there is a rune run, and I'm sure Lorraine won't let me not have one, we will see some really great stuff. And it's a chance of getting to know runes firsthand, to, get your fingers on them.
Yeah, yes. And I remember you saying that in order to truly appreciate a rune, you have to be able to feel it and touch it. And
Yes.
looking at it through a piece of glass does not do it justice.
No. The tactile thing about a rune stone, and that's one of the few things that even people with who are blind or have sight problems, you can still appreciate a rune stone by just feeling it. But it's also an important scientific instrument because runes, they're carved into stone, but these grooves can look, it's difficult sometimes just by sight to distinguish between a carved grove and a natural one. But if you put your tip of your finger there, there's a marked difference in the character. So that's how you can find out whether it's carved or not. And I was one on the field runologist trip with 4 of my expert colleagues, and we spent half an hour discussing whether a short twig was there or not. And everybody else would have died of boredom to hear that. But, to us, it was like Christmas Day.
Well, thank you. We do have some questions coming in. Would you say something more about the idea that the death of a person is not recognized until their name was mentioned for the last time?
Yeah, well, of course, that's just a saying, but it did strike me as extremely fascinating idea that, people do die. I'm in a generation people started doing so, and the generation ahead of me is more or less gone now. And you would think that people, even though if you're not a believer in the hereafter or life, paradise and so forth, even people who don't believe that still have memories of their past ancestors. And I think it is a nice thought that if we keep repeating people's names, they're not truly gone. And so that this works then 2,000 years back in time as well.
Perfect. We have another question. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I'm wondering if you have any theories as to why there are some, but so few runic inscriptions in Iceland from the Viking Age, in your opinion.
I don't have a good answer. I got to admit that is the best scientific answer. Often I don't know. Were the Icelanders extremely lazy in the Viking Age? I don't think so. I think that, first of all, we have to remember that they were colonizing a previously more or lless unsettled country. There were a few Irish monks there, but they had to really start everything from the very top. And if you would go across and do this, is this the first thing you would do to carve a rune stone? I don't believe so. Also, we should remember that in Iceland, stone, you don't find a lot of granite and other good stone. It's a lot of lava, and it's not particularly suitable to carve rune stones. Also, they came from Norway, most of them, or from the British Isles where they had settled in between, and they didn't have very many runic inscriptions there either. And those were also colonizing. So I think the times they were just busy doing other stuff. That's the best answer I can offer.
Okay. That sounds very logical. We have gotten an answer from Lorraine Jensen, as Henrik said, the president of the American Association of Runic Studies, and she said that hopefully the next round, Runed Round 6, will be in late August 2025 in Gotland. And if you want to keep track of of the progress or learn more about that organization, and that is at aars.org. American is, or no, wait a minute. It's Runic
runicstudies.org.
Studies, runicstudies.org. Yes, AARS will take you to a completely different organization. It's www.runicstudies.org. Let's see, and we have a comment from Laurel that says, I don't have a question, but I want to thank you for doing the webinar. It's been fascinating. I'm so happy to be here and learn about runes. And I think with that, Henrik, I want to thank you. And before we end, I want to say a little bit more about what's coming up from the INLUS. Our next online series of Icelandic language classes starts this week. There are still a few seats available, and I mean just a few. Information on the courses and the costs can be found at inlus.org under the Travel and Culture tab. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, April 16th at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. The travel agency Hey Iceland will be talking to us about tourism and travel opportunities in Iceland. And then on April 30th, we will be talking with Iceland's ambassador to the US, Birgit Ellertsdottir, at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. She is completing her post in the US and will be returning to Iceland later this spring. She has been very gracious with her time over the last few years, talking with us and sharing her perspectives. Facilitating that conversation will be Ingebjörg M. Stefansdottir, the honorary Icelandic consul to Colorado. And finally, our spring newsletter, The Connect, is available on our website. You can read about many things, including the Ring Road music playlist, the INLUS reading group, the film The Day Iceland Stood Still, which is about the 1975 women's strike in Iceland. And you can also meet our newest board member and learn about other changes in our board. So lots of things coming up, lots of things to see and do. And Henrik, thank you again for just a wonderful presentation. I appreciate it. And thank you all to the attendees for joining us today. Bye-bye.